Thank you.
Minutes, comments, corrections?
I don't have any comments.
I had asked Emily to add the photos because those were referenced in the discussion, and since I missed that part of the discussion, I mean, obviously I knew Pro store, but I didn't know the specifics of what was being discussed there. So, okay, so motion to approve.
I can move.
Good. Kate moved, I'll second.
Okay. And Ellie got squeaked on the line. Next time. Okay, all in favor of approving the minutes as amended?
Aye.
Okay, unanimous. Thank you all. Okay. So now we're going to turn to our village bylaw work session. And there were a lot of materials to look over, and hopefully we're pretty up to speed with this. It was really helpful to have them kind of parsed out into different chunks, like the communication log and the survey responses and that kind of thing. So thank you for that, and thank you for all the prep that you and Hack have done so far, and Michael. It's looking, it's really an amazing amount of work, so really appreciate that, and also really appreciate the staff memo that was very helpful to kind of break things down a little bit. So can I turn it over to you, Emily, and you want to guide us through the next piece?
Yeah, that sounds good. And I'll use my memo kind of as a guide. So we launched this in June, where we published the updated bylaw chapter that we have in front of you. And then in early July, we did a public outreach launch, including the walking tour that people could do in person or virtually, surveys online. I did a guided tour that was well attended, as well as a community meeting that had some good discussion. All of this to get input from everybody, planning commissioners and residents and property owners in the village on where is the bylaw moving in the right direction to meet the village master plan goals, and where is a little bit more work needed to bring clarity. I also had a really good meeting with Chapin a few weeks ago, going line by line through it. So I think this process is going to bring about the best version of this chapter possible, and playing devil's advocate, working through language to make sure we get it right now and aren't left floundering administering it when there's something that doesn't quite make sense. So having all eyes on it has been super helpful. Tonight we're also really lucky to have Michael Allen of Regrowth Planning with us. So he's been helping bring the graphic design, the illustrations, the photos that take the standards and bring them to life.
Until Michael says something, you don't see him on Zoom.
Oh, well, until I speak, but
There.
hello.
Yeah.
Yes. There.
And I didn't know if you also let people on Zoom know who John is.
Oh, yeah. So also tonight, in addition to Michael, we have John Marcotte, who is the vice chair of the HAC. He's attending and can help, provide guidance on what the HAC has worked on and had grappled with, as well as, the perspective in administering this. So they provide guidance to the development review board as well. So before I turn it over to Michael to give like a quick overview about himself, the focus for tonight is really looking at the permit process and thresholds in this document, looking at the written standards, the images and illustrations, and where things could be edited or things could be added to better communicate intent. And overall, based on the goals of the village master plan and the input we've received to date, are there any major adjustments that are needed? Tonight, I do want to avoid going too far down the rabbit hole on materials list. That topic has certainly generated the most input. It's got the most survey responses to date. There's 21. And we're gonna have a community meeting on September 20th. So after this meeting, Michael and I will have some broader direction. Through the month of August, we'll work on another draft. Hopefully by early September, we'll publish it in advance of another community meeting. And that's a good opportunity to focus on the fine tunes, because materials, you can turn a box on or off. You can add something to the list more easily. So mechanically, it's much easier by law amendment.
At some point, could you pull up the village master plan goals? Because frankly, I didn't go and review those and we're supposed to be in sync with them. Would it make sense for us as a committee to do that tonight at some point?
Yeah, that sounds good. Before I do that, Michael, do you want to talk about your work so far?
Yeah, I mean, kudos to Emily. I think Emily's been doing nothing against you. But Emily's been doing a lot of work. I think kind of getting the word out and organizing all the different parts of this. My goal is always to try and develop a document that is easier to use than your typical codes and has a lot of photographic examples and illustrations that help to convey, because if one person says, I would like to see a park here, I guarantee you there's 10 different people visualizing 10 different parks, and what is it, what do they mean by that? And so trying to add some I guess visualizations wherever possible. I still think there's some room for some additional graphic illustrations, photos, examples, and I'm still working on trying to collect some of those. As Emily will probably tell you, I've been eager to sit down with you guys because I don't want to get too far through this document and then have you guys look at it and say, no, you're going the wrong direction. So right now I'm very eager to, I've seen some of the comments that have come in, get your feedback on where we can adjust and course correct and where there's areas for improvement. So I'm here to work with you guys until this is completed. So.
And I'll just say it's great to have it in this easy to read format with illustrations.
So before we dive into the 8 topic areas that I've laid out, want to spend some time debriefing the public input received, and I think Chapin, we can also kind of highlight, what those village master plan goals are. So the public input, in my reading of it, there is some support for what we're doing, and I was also detecting some confusion about what these standards are today, and confusion that, we have the village zoning district today, and it is a mixed use where commercial and non-residential uses are allowed next to a residential property or in conjunction with a residential use. As well as confusion that the National Register Historic District is an existing designation, and it will remain. So this proposal is not undoing that National Register designation. And I think some of the comments that I heard, the standards are very vague now, and they're becoming prescriptive in the bylaw, and some confusion and misunderstanding about what that means for property owners. Right now, you don't know what material standard you're going to be held to for your roof or your windows. And I think there's a level of uncertainty around having that codified in a document, whereas right now it's just very vague and very nebulous. And I think there's different levels of comfort with those two processes. Megan and Chapin, you both live in the village and have seen that, how the challenge is administering the current bylaw, and that as well, stacking the hack for 15 years before me. And John being currently on the hack, seeing those challenges of ad hoc decisions and the impact they have on individual property owners.
And could I say about the feedback that one theme is that there is general support we're loosening some of the material restrictions. I think even among people that want to maintain the aesthetic, they are understanding that things that aren't visible from the road or that were previously replaced with a different material or that are look the same but are made of a different material, that those three categories, I think people are pretty universally saying that's okay, that's a good thing. Because most of the people who had complaints, it's complaints about how strict the rules are.
Mhm,
And those are ways to relax the rules without changing the aesthetic.
mhm.
Because there did seem to be a lot of support for the aesthetic. You know, in general, people want the village either to stay exactly the way it is, or at least to stay somewhat historical. But individual owners of properties are frustrated with following the current procedures.
So I'm just gonna quickly highlight what those objective statements are in the village master plan. And if we have questions, we can kind of go into the narrative around them. But objective for development standards, so addressing the size, mass, and scale of new structures, the relationship to the street that a structure has, develop bylaw standards for rear lot and mixed use development. Material standards both for historic structures and new structures. And develop material standards for additions and outbuildings. Objectives for a demolition process and standard, as well as a demolition by neglect standard. There are some objectives that aren't directly related to the bylaw revisions around calming traffic, enhancing visual appeal, connections between the village and the rest of Williston. So those are thinking about broader select board capital improvements, working with V-Trans on the state right of way. Other bylaw things, balance the scale of intensity of commercial uses in the village. So right now there's a hard limit on square footage, but not so much a consideration of the nuisance elements that a business might have in relationship to a residential. And then residential vibrancy, so a policy around explore what housing opportunity could be created here, a variety of housing types, so thinking multifamily, smaller units, but that are in scale with the village.
Can I ask a quick question on that, Emily? In the objectives, you mentioned, oh, that's so much easier to see, thank you. As you scroll up just a little bit, there was some material about the sidewalk type and streets. So if those are objectives, then are they in a different bylaw, or why aren't they in the master?
They're in the master plan because they're town-wide policies for other town activities that are beyond the zoning bylaw. So if the town were to work on, taking control of the state right of way, or working with V-Trans on, a corridor study around sidewalks, pedestrian crossings, should utilities go underground. It's broader goals for other town activities the town could do beyond the zoning bylaw.
I guess for things that don't necessarily fall under the jurisdiction of the zoning.
Right, okay, so I just have a reason for asking this.
So where do we address this?
Right,
Yeah.
I mean, partly, but also, I think this relates to some of the, things like enhancing the visual appeal of the village. Like, does that belong in zoning or not? Some of it, as far as things like street trees and, lampposts and so forth, are mentioned here. Yeah, absolutely, those could go into zoning, but then, I think some of the public comments were about, and I sort of sympathize with some of this, were things that maybe leaned into something different, like a beautification program, or something
Right.
beyond zoning. And so I guess I'm sort of struggling to figure out where, if these objectives are in our approved master plan, but they're not in this chapter. What, first of all, why, and then secondly, where do they then get picked up?
Right, so why they're not in this current bylaw is because. Primarily Williston Road is a state right of way, and that extends not just the edge of pavement, but beyond that to the sidewalk. So things like. Street trees that would be in that right of way, lampposts that would be a public utility. Street furniture that would be town maintained, those are things that. Can't readily be accessed through zoning in this context. Form-based code, I think, is a little bit different because you're creating new streets, or the scale of development is, can warrant those types of things. And this statement in the bylaw gives us that opportunity to leverage state funds, leverage grants. Hey, we say we want to do this in our town plan. If there's, a grant available to underground utilities, we can point to our master plan that says, this is something that the town has collectively stated we want. And I think a lot of that momentum that we've heard, a desire for a beautification program or trees, some of that momentum is better suited beyond a village bylaw. Like if there's going to be a community group or looking at grant opportunities to help with that, that's something separate from a zoning code.
Okay, so one last question, I'm sorry to interrupt and get this going, but there are streets in the village that are not Wilson Road. So where do they fall?
Right, so there's Tower Lane, Maple Road, Slate Barn Drive,
Village Road,
Village Grove, Oak Hill Road, North Wilson Road.
Churchill.
So those would fall under the existing jurisdiction of the bylaw. So chapter 42 is village zoning district specific. That would primarily relate to chapters 13 and 15 about access and maintenance. So if somebody were to do a major development, then the DRB has the authority to say, provide your sidewalk along your segment of your right of way frontage. And then the town has more authority to negotiate in those scenarios, because the town has control over those roads to say, okay, you can put your sidewalk within our right of way. And that's something that doesn't need to be explicitly stated in the village, because if the development is going to the discretionary permit level, then the DRB would say, okay, does this development meet the size and proportionality to require that sidewalk? And then street lamps would follow the public works specifications.
Okay,
et cetera.
that makes so much more sense now. Okay, so when we turn around and move forward and kind of bring this, to a public hearing and so forth, I feel like that might help clarify some things, like just to distinguish the fact that Wilson Road being state road creates a scenario where we need strategic statements like this in the master plan to point to say, this is our vision, right?
For programmatic
Right,
implementation.
right.
You can't do it through zoning.
Exactly,
It's not our-
right. Yeah, so that really clarified it for me. Thank you very much, because that was, and I think, yeah, so if we can just be thinking about how to message that in our, public hearing and other kinds of communications.
Right.
It may be kind of a picky detail that only we would pay attention to, but,
Yeah.
but I still think like people who live in the village on, or not on Wilson Road are gonna be saying like, well, why isn't my street beautification in here? Or, what about me?
Right.
Yeah, okay, thank you.
Yeah, that's a
Thank you for
really
that.
important point.
And one of the commenters said they lived on Tower Lane. And I really felt like in the end of tonight, we should be able to say, I wrote it down. The people in Tower Lane, Village Grove Church, and so forth. What they do has less direct impact than the other parts of the village. Yeah, I felt like in the end, I was thinking we need to simplify and just have contributing structure. and not contributing structure, no matter where it is,
Mhm.
and not have the Williston Road. Moves on stuff. That's my feeling, that we should move to simplification of those things. But what do we say about? Is there a second category? If you're on Tower Lane, it's a dead end street that does not have contributing structures on it. And so why do we have? Should we say that's not part of the village district, it's by the residential district zone? But it felt to me like it's a misstep. When I saw those comments, I thought, yeah, you're right. It's like, why on Tower Lane do you have anything different than you would have if you were in Southbridge?
Right, so the person that comments on Tower Lane, the house was built in 1969. And they were interested in changing the exterior of their home. And I think the existing hack interpretation has been to treat those types of properties very flexibly. And this would codify it where they would have that same level, if not more, flexibility.
Okay.
The subtext, and I should have included my response to this person, and I've had other conversations informally, correcting misinformation or like the trauma of past development or past
Yes.
historic review that has been very strict, because a lot of people are like, oh, I was told I could never change my windows, I could never change my siding, and I was like, you were probably told that 20 years ago, and that's what you thought for 20 years. And the interpretation of the current rules is different, and where this standard is going is very different. I spoke with one woman who owned a business, and she was like, it was a nightmare getting my sign approved. And even one of the other committee members at the time told the other committee member, stop being mean to this person about their sign. And she's like, and then I heard them treat the next applicant very rudely. And I never wanted to make any change that would make me go back to that board. And so I think what we're trying to course correct is this long-standing fear of how people will be treated. And it's changed over time, but that fear is still out there. Matt, do you have anything to add on that one?
A lot of horror stories out there.
Well, yeah, there's subjective and inconsistent application that's just a result of it being a process operated by humans over a long period of time. There's always a challenge in drafting code of wanting to be really clear and really prescriptive, but not, preclude something good from happening or fail to anticipate a strategy that you couldn't think of. Chapin, to your point about sort of simplicity, the idea of sort of swapping jurisdiction, so it's just contributing, non-contributing. And then at that point, if you think of the village zoning district boundary as a whole, you do have contributing and non-contributing structures kind of in some proximity to one another, where in a general sense, it makes sense for them to follow a similar development pattern. But standards on the structure itself could be quite different without that undermining the goals of the village. And so, you might remember in village master plan, we did this exercise. We had people take a map and say, draw the boundary of the village on the map, and we scanned them all in. And some people had this really expansive circle, and yeah, there you go. And some people took in a pretty big chunk of the residential district all the way out to Mountain View Road. Most people stopped at or near the highway, kind of. So part of the answer is, well, you've got to draw the line somewhere, and there's such a stark difference along the highway boundary because we go to ag rural on the other side, and village otherwise pretty much touches RZD and is pretty compatible with it. So I guess to wind that back in, you are considering a bylaw that would treat density, residential density a little differently, that would treat mixed use a little differently. I think the existing VCD boundary is a pretty good one to start with there. My boundary questions have more to do with ones the commission's looked at before, for example, the idea of expanding eastward toward French Hill, or looking at that appendage that goes down to Southridge Road, down the hill below the Catholic Church. And
It's probably town plan first.
I think that might be more of a town plan and land use designation conversation. If we change those boundaries, we do have to also consider changing them in the town plan. And it's just a question of what's the cohesive village? The other part is, we've talked about the historic district, we've talked about the zoning district tonight. We also have the designated center through the Agency of Commerce and Community
Yes.
Development.
Which is immaterial really to what we're doing.
And it is, except that what they're saying is what they see as a value in a village is a mixed use place. And so their boundary is tighter than the village zoning district boundary, but bigger than the historic district, because they're looking for that fabric of,
I thought it went all the way to Tap Corners.
no. That was one proposal, particularly in statute, when there was perceived to be a direct adjacency requirement
Yes.
to get a growth
Right.
center. But that was dialed back before the two centers were adopted, and actually, in the time that I've been here, the village designation completely expired at one point. We had to reapply rather than renew.
I remember that.
And when we did, the ACCD actually pulled the boundary back up the hill.
So this is
toward
not the
church.
current one? It goes at the church, not down there, it goes on the bottom of the hill.
So this includes the Immaculate Heart of Mary property, but it doesn't go all the way down the hill to Southridge.
Well, what's the red line then?
The red line is the village zoning district boundary. The hatching is the designated center.
Yep.
The yellow
I
is
see what
the
you're saying.
additional review area. And this mint blue is the National Register. I think this is a good segue into the first topic area and creating that simplicity for permit administration. I think it would
Yes.
also mirror for the material standards. So the National Register Historic District is where everything needs a certificate of appropriateness.
By the way, that's not. The hatching part isn't quite accurate in the tiny houses in the historic register.
The hatching is the designated center.
Oh, I'm sorry.
So that's the
Okay.
one place, one of the places other than.
So I'm not in the designated center.
So you're not in the designated center because you're too far beyond that mixed use of civic and commercial and
But
residential.
you are the historic
fabric.
district.
But you are in the National Register District,
Yeah.
because that whole parcel boundary there.
Right.
That
Which means-
hatching, yeah, that could be. It's a little confusing the way that works.
It's,
Yeah.
and you know, it just has to do with, that's what the state is willing to accept as a designated village center for its purposes and some of the financial incentives it provides. So
But so
it's in between.
for this zoning, does it include the Catholic Church?
Our village zoning district includes the Catholic Church, and Emily, additional review area.
No, the
No.
Catholic Church is outside the additional review area. So to the permit threshold point about having National Register and everywhere else and looking at contributing or non-contributing structure, it's essentially even things that are outside the additional review area now, Tower Lane, Village Grove, they still go through some level of review. So it would be that same kind of process.
So still want to make sure I understand the district. The district we're working the zoning for, where is the western end?
It goes to the circ right of way.
So it's the red boundary.
Okay, so it
Yeah,
includes the farmhouse that's down there just to the left of the ponds.
Yes.
Yes.
I didn't realize that.
A lot of that land, so this parcel with the big farmhouse on it, the circ right of way. Matt, correct me if I'm wrong, that's got a conservation easement on
A
it.
lot of the land does, yes.
The land does, and then the Allen Brook runs along here, and there's some tributaries, so a lot of that low-lying land has
Yes.
little to no development potential. These two existing houses that are right up on Williston Road can barely put in another shed.
Bounded by wetlands, right?
No, I think the most interesting thing is probably the land on the other side of South Ridge Road where it's flat and there's a big setback to the Allen Brook, but there's still a fair size chunk of land where South Ridge Road comes in. Some folks may recall the structure that used to be there. Mid green, large house thing. It's probably been at least 10 years since the
But
fire
not
department
for- not
burned
last-
it down for practice.
Not last year.
Yeah, it was the big residential structure that went with the farm.
And recently, there's been somebody's been doing some
Second floor,
light
yeah.
ag gardening
Yeah.
there.
That's
Oh, right.
Joyce Goodrich. That was where the Goodrich barn was, and where those trees are on the left there is where the Goodrich house was. The Goodrich farm that became Southbridge Development.
So it's been interesting in the years I've been here, staff has very occasionally spoken to the owners, which is Snyder. About what the potential on that property is.
Only to the east of Southbridge Road or to the west as well, or that Val to west.
Once you go to the west, it's pretty well wet meadow right up to the road. So there's a little bit of upland to the east. It may not even be as much upland as it used to be. 'Cause-
Typically wetlands get bigger.
yeah, but it does have the commercial potential that comes with being in the village.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of folks would be a little bit surprised if they
Mhm.
found out there was a proposal for something commercial there. That shows, the blue, the Allenbrook buffer though, so you can see
Yeah.
that there's quite a lot of it taken up by that buffer and then the 50-foot buffer to the tributary that comes down, from Pinecrest Village on the other
Yeah.
side.
Correct me if I'm wrong, as far as the zoning draft that we're working with right now, we don't acknowledge or do anything particular to the village center designation, right? That
No.
doesn't, so that doesn't play into the boundary, or it doesn't change the rules as far as our zoning is concerned, right?
Nope,
Okay.
the only thing that does is gives folks within that boundary access to some tax incentives. Related to restoring non-residential properties. And it gives the town access to some planning assistance and funding
Yeah.
through the state.
At minimum, we could change this map out to the one that has the designated village center
You could show it.
on it.
But I'm just worried that it's gonna cause the confusion
Yeah, I
that
think
that,
on that other
Chapin
map
pointed
we
out.
looked at, we shouldn't have the cross hatching for the village center.
Yeah, that's why I checked. I wanted to see
Yeah.
what our map,
Yeah, no,
right
it has no regulatory effect.
right, that's what I thought, okay.
So I,
Maybe we add that just as like an explainer box.
Yeah,
to get back to where we started, I support when the time comes, extending it to the east to the Johnson Farm or beyond. Right now it stops at the Allenbrook on the east.
Expanding what?
The district, the village
The village.
district,
Okay,
BZD,
not
BZD,
the-
because there's the cemetery and there's at least 4 historic homes along
Yeah.
there.
Yeah.
And it feels like the village, it doesn't,
There's two cemeteries.
Right, and that's
Yeah.
something that the hack in their initial conversations talked about.
yeah,
And pretty much if we wanted to run it as a town plan thing, they have some, existing boilerplate and. The properties that would be impacted.
some folks may recall a development proposal in that area 6 or 7 years ago for a fairly conventional 2 duplexes
Yes.
next to each other on a shared drive. It
Yes.
sort of looked like about a 1974 style. And
Yes.
there was a lot of strife at the DRB at the pre-application. And, the answer was, well, that's in the residential district and we have no design standards in the residential district. We have height and setbacks, but you build whatever you want to build. And there was a lot of surprise, I think, that we didn't have design
Yes.
control there.
and that I remember the person who wanted to develop it wanted 2 driveways on the Route 2 and.
And 4 first,
4
and then
driveways.
2.
Yeah.
And so there was a lot of contesting that stuff.
Yeah,
Oh, yeah.
it's a tricky location. It's ag rural to residential zoning district to village. So whether that district bound moves or a future town plan amendment, should there be a townwide overlay, because there are historic structures outside of the village
Yes.
that are, at risk.
So- For this, Michael hasn't spoken. Jumping the gun a little bit on one of your first points in here. To me, it would simplify things greatly if we said everything that's in the National Historic District is a contributing structure. And then for everything else in this village zoning district, if we assess whether it's a contributing structure or not, and you either a contributing structure or not. And everything else falls to that. Doesn't matter if you're on Route 2. Doesn't matter if you're in the additional analysis area or if you're on the side street.
I think you'd still need to have that contributing structure determination
Yes.
in the National Register. Because there are a couple of properties
That are
like Corner
not,
Quick or Lizot where you might want to let them do. not, maintain that exact
Yes.
thing.
That's a good point. That's a good point.
Yeah, I think I was thinking of along similar lines in the survey when I answered, I felt like, can't we just have a map that has everything already identified?
That's one of the first things
course I
that
wanna know.
that's one of the first things that I bounced off of Matt and Emily was, okay, can I get a list of all the contributing structures? So it's very clear and everybody
Right.
knows. And they informed me, that's not an easy list to put together, and it's really gonna depend on a lot of factors, and they don't necessarily want to go down a road where we're gonna tie our hands in some
Yeah,
cases.
no, I understand.
It's likely to shift over time.
Yeah.
Right,
Right.
and my natural instinct to simplify things, I want to just give everybody a list and make boom, now everybody knows, but I eventually agreed with their assessment that would tie their hands, so.
Right, and then the hearing process would all be people saying
And then-
how should or shouldn't be
Yeah,
on
and
that list.
then we would have 2 years of people contesting
True.
the results of that.
Yes. So,
Yeah.
and I think your solution with the letter is good.
Mhm.
I think we need it. We need a process, and that's the process, and that's
Mhm.
gonna.
And then later on, if we wanted to add an amendment to this, that is that list. That would be a possible add-on later on.
Yeah, it would be great to keep that, as you amend, you add it, the challenge is, working off of either the National Register designation application or either the 1976 or 1996 historic structures inventories, is they'll often say something like, this is a historic property, the house was built in 1840, also there's some outbuildings. And sometimes they're drawn on and sometimes they're not, sometimes they're significant and sometimes they're not. So I think there's certainly a list of stuff that's definitely contributing. Almost anything that's been inventoried probably is, but there's a lot of detail missing from that when you're having that regulatory conversation,
Mhm.
that was the idea, was make that determination clear, make it appealable and rebuttable, make it binding once it has been decided, and really try to use this process to add that clarity to the village.
The only other alternative that I could think of toward your goal is that we try and put together a list of ones that are absolutely without,
One's
without-
listed.
that nobody's gonna contest, that we have, definitive backing that these are contributing structures, and that this is just the short list. There may be others, but I'm not ultimately convinced whether or not that would simplify things or not. You still have to go through a determination for most of the others,
The
so.
other thing we could do is, as applications come up and we do that determination letter, mark the property as this was determined to be historic, and if somebody could
So
argue
there's a
it's
record.
changing in the future, but we shouldn't have to reassess it 2 years later.
No.
So I think we do have that written in here. That the contributing structure would expire 2 years after being signed and issued. So was that one where we wanted to say it's binding unless new information is presented otherwise?
I mean, to me, you shouldn't have to reassess it unless someone contests it because it's something else that's changed. But for the most part, with age, buildings will become historic rather than lose their historic.
Hopefully, if we're not letting people neglect them.
Right, if this all works as intended.
Mhm.
No, I think that's fair, and I think you can always give someone the opportunity to apply to take something off the list.
Yes.
If they say, oh, well, when I got my house designated, I didn't mean for that
Yeah.
shed in the back
So-
to be included, but it was, I'd like that taken off, or.
To give a real life example, my house was moved from Williston Road 400 feet back. With it was moved what was called a blacksmith shed. That had no foundation, and it was moved in the 50s, and I don't know whether it was the 50s or some other time, the siding was fiberboard. And the roof was scraps of sheet metal. So there's nothing you would identify as historic, but when they did the historic district for the National Register, they included that in the register. It's also behind my house, which is already 400 feet back, and you can't see it even from the driveway. There's no view of it from
You can
anywhere.
even see it, we were next door.
Yeah. I did get permission to take it down when it was falling into the ground, and I of course offered if anybody wanted to salvage it, they could, and then I took a piece of it and put it in the new shed. Per the recommendations. But just, that's an example where it actually was in the historic register as a documented building. But the criteria, the hack agreed it was not something that we could or should say.
Mhm. So I made notes here that we would get rid of the expiration and then we'd update this new information thing. To say if someone needs to seek further clarification or wants to change it, they can do so.
And would that be just with planning staff or did that?
So the way this is set up, it's issued by the zoning administrator with advice of HAC and DRB. So I think in some instances, the administrator might choose that clarification from them.
Yeah, I think in particular, if you were in, if somebody came in with something that was otherwise an administrative permit, and the administrator says, well, wait a minute, I think what you're doing is on a contributing structure. I want to make that determination, or I want to seek that determination, or make it with a public body, and then I'll, or the person comes and says, I would like to take that structure down, and the zoning administrator says, I don't think you should, because I think it's contributing, but we've never looked at it. That triggers that process. And again, it's a rebuttable, appealable process where, if the answer is you can't take it down because I've determined it's contributing, there's a way for the applicant or the owner to say, well, I disagree, and have that adjudicated.
Public input was that we shouldn't charge for that determination.
Right.
Correct, yeah. So for topic one, permit thresholds and process. I think that, Matt, does that give us enough direction? on
So-
Simplifying.
Yeah, you can look at my notes at some point, Emily, but what I'm hearing is there was a desire to simplify the map. In other words, make jurisdiction about contributing, non-contributing. A little bit of clarification about that process, the idea that contributing would be a non-expiring determination, but that an owner could apply to have it clarified or re-review if they wanted to. And Chapin, you had started by saying maybe everything in the National Register District is contributing automatically. Emily brought up, there's a couple examples of things that might not be.
You're right.
The Quick Stop building is actually very old,
Very old.
Yeah.
but it's
And it has
highly
always,
modified.
But yeah,
Right.
it's nothing like it used to be.
there
Right.
used to be a garage on the left side of it there for, was it a fire truck? That where the square on the left side, I think. I remember a garage door.
I mean, when the siding was off at the last time, the number of different and overlapping penetrations to the wall was just incredible, all of the ways it's been configured over the years. So, that might be one where you say, maybe it is contributing, but you decide it's contributing like it is now, not like the
Yeah.
picture of it was in 1976.
Right.
And the gas pump's been there a long time, they're contributing.
So a non-contributing structure is one that, due to date of construction, alterations over time, architectural style or other factors, does not contribute to its historic significance. So in this letter for Corner Quick, what I would probably say is, yeah, we can find the original base that looks super old, but it's got list all the materials and windows and modifications that have made over
modifications.
time.
In the style, which wouldn't necessarily qualify.
Right, which is like a style, it's like no style.
Right. It's the-
Right.
Yeah.
But you raise a good point.
The famous architect Rube Goldberg.
Right.
That's right, but you raise a good point, which is to a lot of people, it feels like a historic fixture because it's been there in that form for 40 years at least.
Mhm.
So,
And has been a store for
Yes.
longer than that.
Right.
So is the armory a non-conforming structure?
it's been that way a long time.
That's a tricky one.
It's old enough.
It's old enough, it's as
Yeah,
old as I
it's-
am.
But if they want to modify it, they have to build the old residential high school used to be there.
So in the guiding call out box for what can be a contributing structure. Typically built before 1900, especially between 1820 and 1860. And what the bylaw says is you turn to the intent statement in the village master plan. So I would say because that's like a 1960s building,
In the context of the fabric, the architectural fabric that makes up Williston Village.
right?
It's so far outside the range, the date range, that it's not contributing to the historic character of Williston as we recognize it. That would be my determination. Yes,
Another argument
yeah.
towards on the opposite too would be, well, the village is a mix of styles and it is, characteristic of that 1960s. What is
Brutalism. whatever, yeah.
What about the library?
rural brutalism?
There's the original old building.
Mhm.
It was the original library, but now
They've added on.
7/8 of the building is not that building.
Mhm. Yeah, so that's why I think having this clear process where you can do it one at a time is gonna be helpful, and then you'll be able to work with that property owner. So on the street, it's hard to make that determination, but being able to get more information about its materials and.
To the point of, and I think this is an important topic, is it seems that what we've heard is the public seems to be in support of what this document is trying to work toward. Their wavering comes mostly in that they don't have a full understanding of, well, what are the regulations right now, and what's being changed. Is trying to make sure we can clarify what's being changed for the public before September 20th. And, to that end, do we wish to describe how our contributing structures ascertained today? I mean, it's not really, we don't have a list right now. There's no formal process for that right now, correct?
Right. It's usually made at the time someone's submitting an application. And sometimes they've, put in money and effort into working with an architect or an engineer to design a renovation or design an addition. And the committee is pushing them in a different direction. Matt, am I summarizing that?
I think so. If I caught where I came in correctly. So was part of the question a process question of how contributing would be, like what findings would you make to say this is a contributing structure?
Well, how it's different today
Okay,
than it
So
will be.
Would it be fair to characterize to everybody that the change being made right now is we've come up with a more structured process for
right.
how you determine whether or not your structure is contributing or not. That's, I guess, the effective change of this code. Otherwise, we haven't determined which structures are or are not. We haven't changed which structures are or are not. We've just established a more formal process, I think.
Yeah, and I think there's two ways of looking at it that are actually kind of funnily opposite in their direction. One is we're applying more nuance within the district, because today's rules say these are the rules for the village, and the only thing that's different on the sub districts of the village is the process. But the zoning administrator is supposed to look at that 50s raised ranch and apply the exact same rules in the VZD to that 50s raised ranch as the DRB would to a structure in the National Register District. So in that way, we're applying more nuance,
Or more flexibility.
more flexibility. The other thing we're doing, though, is we're trying to simplify the jurisdiction. Instead of having a district that contains these, two sub-districts plus sort of neither here nor there, is to say it's about the building, not what boundary we're inside of. So I think it's more equal treatment in that regard, but more nuanced application. So if we were doing a staff report for the hack today, we would say the building is in the additional review area, therefore a certificate of appropriateness is required. And then we would go on to say that building is a 1875 brick house with a contemporary addition, and we would start getting into the characteristics, and then we would work up to, so this is what the structure is, this is what's important about it, why it matters to the district, here's what the applicant's proposing to do. Here's whether that's a thing that enhances or undermines its historic significance and its contribution to the village. So wipe all that out and say, this is in the village zoning district, it contributes to the historic quality of the village because, and we're making the finding.
Yeah.
That now we're gonna call this contributing going forward. And then we have a more nuanced set of rules and say, okay, because of that, these things fall from it. And it also means we're not having these weird conversations about putting true divided light in all wood windows in a 50s race ranch
Yes.
anymore.
Or a new bill.
Or in a new build.
Yeah.
So, and that's the other thing, and I kind of clarified this with Emily, is to say, so is it the structures that are contributing or is it properties? And that's something to think about, but where we kind of land was it's structures. And if you're, a new structure is never going to be a contributing structure right after it's built. Doesn't mean it's not subject to some development standards and you're not
Yes.
trying to, keep that harmony in the village. And we talked about sort of some of those stylistic ideas around what can a new structure
It should have the
do.
massing scale,
Right.
positioning and so forth that's specified throughout.
But as Emily started that with, we're not gonna necessarily say there's gotta be a reproduction 1810 true divided light with window with wavy glass inside that building. It's okay if it's new, but its form, its placement, et cetera, its mass will be harmonious with the historic village.
Mhm.
It's maybe a little too nitpicky, but the statement in there that it's typically pre-1900, I don't think that helps, especially the statement before that, that it's typically 1820, 1860 or something. The
Mhm.
majority of those structures that are in the historic district are in that range. But take, for example, the Lion apartment building, the red brick apartment building, about 1905 or something.
Mhm.
And that doesn't match anything else historically around there, but it's been around for more than 100 years. So it's after 1900, but it's
Mhm.
probably, it was a store in the village. And it's been around more than, so I almost wonder if we should just say are typically at least 100 years old or
I was
something.
thinking the same thing.
And that way,
Yeah.
20 years from now, our statement about dates is.
Yeah, Megan, I think one of your comments was on this one, so I think this section needs some language workshopping.
And I would say too, that the Lion building adds a lot to the character, because it's quirky and
Mhm.
different,
Mhm.
but in a really sort of appealing way.
Mhm.
I had some questions about table A, and I don't know when to ask them, if the threshold conversation is part of that.
Table A on which page?
And
Should be
Yeah,
page
it's-
4.
Oh, it's-
Yeah, Chapin had some comments on this and I kind of threw it together at the last minute and Michael made it look pretty, but it's still kind of a mess. About breaking down what's a modification, what's an administrative permit, what's a discretionary permit. And simplifying
And having signs and.
and having things flow.
Certain things be, upgrade utilities is here and signs is down here, just put them all together,
Mhm.
things that are not structures.
so my questions were more about like some of the specifics in there. Is that appropriate to talk about now, or do you wanna move
Well,
on?
I think it's up for you guys to decide, so it's 8 o'clock.
Does the current version have just 2 columns?
We have a working draft on my desk in red
Okay, because
pen.
we were talking about just, once if we
Right.
simplify the contributing, not contributing, we don't have a third thing.
Right, we take the geographic dimension away and
So the all other areas column could,
It
Go
because you
away.
could have,
go
a-
away.
and it, yes, because for example, on Maple Road, there are 2 historic homes that are not, right now, would not meet this criteria because they're in the other area.
So,
well, there's certain instances here where in the all other areas, we have no permit required,
Right.
which is obviously a much easier option for the homeowner. And I don't know if we would want to take that away from them or alternately move it just under non-contributing structure, no permit required, and that's, I think, up to you, Bax. What do you?
Yeah, I would, from the administrator perspective, I would consider that. So for example, the really small accessory structure, what we might call the Costco shed, under 120 square feet, under 10 feet in height. That's not a shed that requires a permit anywhere else in Williston on a residential property. It is required to meet setbacks. So you can't stick it right up against your neighbor's property line. I would be comfortable saying that is, it's also required, I believe, to be in a backyard, back or side yard under our current zoning. So under 120 square feet, under 10 feet in height, in a back or side yard, meeting setbacks, yes, somebody might go buy a plastic one from Costco
or wherever, yeah.
and have it in their backyard in the village. And we've had people ask about that before. So the question for the group is that okay? Is the degree with,
Does it have to meet the other things like the setback requirements, side yard setback and so forth? Yeah.
yeah. So the question is, like, I'm trying to come up with like the worst possible shed somebody could stick in the village if no permit was required. Or the other alternative would to keep it like the non-contributing structure where you just say, yeah, you need to get a permit. And then are we applying any rules to it that are different? So
Some of that comes down to national register versus everywhere else.
but again, we're not modifying a structure in my shed example.
Right.
Like, can I stick a plastic shed behind the Bradish house? And not be offending anything about the National Register District?
We could replace that thing that's about to fall into the creek.
And I would argue that you often can, because the scale is just so small and, it's
So-
virtually portable.
To me, if the primary building on the lot is a contributing structure, then the positioning of such a shed is something that requires some review. Especially just, can you see it from the road? And if you can see it from the road, does it change the quality of the historic district? If the house that it's going behind is not a contributing structure, then it's hard to say we should have.
Or you just say, sheds in the village, permit or not,
Yeah,
can't be plastic. Just like they have to meet setbacks, whether they have a permit or not. So, I think the point's well taken, Chapin, and the one thing to think about is if you say a permit is required, then you want to identify what criteria is the zoning administrator then going to use in their review.
Right, we wouldn't make that criteria here in this table, it would have to go elsewhere in the document, but I think, yes, to your point
Right.
about it, is it this far back, is it so on and so forth. Megan, is your,
I have
you
a
just
couple
want,
other really quick questions.
yeah, I wasn't sure, is it generally, are you
Yeah.
looking to simplify this
That,
table or?
not so much. I had actually a little bit more specific questions about certain things being triggered.
Mhm.
So halfway down the page where it says new residential where 5 dwelling unit equivalents or fewer combined existing and proposed, that one. It says growth management allocated administratively up to 5 per year in DVD. But I guess I'm wondering, like, if we want to encourage infill, do we consider taking these out of growth management? So we might not have an answer right now, but I just wanted to raise that question. Because we've used the taking out of growth management in other circumstances as a way to encourage something we want, like affordable housing and chapters.
we are putting 5 a year into the district. You're saying why haven't?
Yeah,
Yeah.
so I'm just saying, maybe this is a conversation we should have,
Yeah.
and not necessarily right now.
Mhm.
Also, the one below that, where it says new residential where more than 5. Or where 5. And this is where I'm confused,
Mhm.
Five
Is
or
it
fewer that live next to you.
5 or fewer in combination with, oh, I see, okay, so mixed use and commercial count as some. Portion, okay, gotcha. I didn't understand that.
I see where you're
I forgot that.
confused, and
Yeah.
I agree with this confusion. I think my intent here is, you know, ideally where there's an existing structure, if someone is, you know, converting something to residential, like a single family to multifamily units, does that need to go through the same discretionary permit level of review? Or is an administrative permit sufficient to consider its site planning, its parking, et cetera? At the last meeting, the planning commission did express, you know, creating a growth management area specifically for the village. And whether some things either get allocated administratively, if it's below a DRB review level, or if it's administered by the DRB, creating that category for the village. I do see where this could use some workshopping, especially in light of some feedback we heard at the community meeting, where there's a big difference between 5 units and something that looks like a single family house
Right.
and 5 units that are individual houses, and trying to create some more nuance there, because there is a big difference between those unit types and another Slate Barn Drive, even though at the end of the day, it might be the same number of units.
So then one more clarification then, between these two lines where they both start with new residential, only the top one triggers growth management and the bottom one doesn't. That was another source of confusion.
Oh, why trigger growth management on 5 or less, but not 5 or more?
Yes, exactly.
Good point.
I think the intent would be, you would do it for 5 or more, but I'll defer to what conversations we've had. You know, I think Emily and I talked about this a little bit today, because I keyed in on this related to administration is, I think probably my opinion would be the right threshold for administrative is you're converting an existing house, you're not really making any changes or additions to it, but you're turning the big old farmhouse into 5 or fewer dwellings of some kind. And maybe you're doing some work on the site related to adding some parking. We've got some nice clear standards about how that needs to be configured and screened and all of that. And there's just sort of a question for the group to think about how easy would you want to make something like that? Obviously, it gets a lot harder when it goes to public hearing. Just the process takes longer and it's staffed and there's a more intensive level of a butter notification, et cetera. But is there some interest in something, you know, right now, the only administrative creation of a new dwelling that can happen is an accessory dwelling unit in in-law apartment, and that's true everywhere in town. So the question is, in light of some of the goals of the village master plan and some of the fabric of what we have, which is oftentimes these large old houses that no longer make sense as a single house for one family, does the group want to propose making that administratively easier, also with all of these heightened design and site design standards?
It's hard to imagine converting a single family home to a 4 or 5 units without making some exterior changes like entrances or something. So it's hard to think it wouldn't come up for review for those reasons.
It might happen on the back of the structure. That might be a piece to think about. But yeah, I think you're right, Jim, but at some point, that's the other part, is you're just doing enough anyway. That you're going to trip a threshold.
I think, so overall for this topic area, I think we know that changes need to be made to make this clearer and make some of those trigger points more distinct. But I don't know if further workshopping it right now.
That's fine.
And I think
just
if-
wanted to provide it.
Yeah, if any individual commission members are thinking after this, hey, I'm really concerned about this permit threshold or this trigger level, reach out to us, because I think we're gonna be revamping this whole table.
I wonder about in places where there's no back to Michael's original point, where we're losing some things where you don't need to get a permit at all, or you don't need it. Where the places where it says hack advice for building and site design, when we talked about the 10 less than foot high shed, to me, if it says contributing structure, you do want hack advice for the site plan, you know, where it's located, I think. Does that make sense that we might at times have hack advice on site?
I think it would, yeah, it would depend a little bit on how strict your rules generally are on siting of accessory structures. So you can really say backyard only, and backyard
Yes.
definitively means behind the rearest part of the primary
And
structure
if
on the
you're on a
site.
corner lot, you don't have a backyard or.
Or you have two fronts, and therefore, you know, so there's some. It takes some doing, or it needs to be something that gets a little more review,
Mhm.
under some kind of, these are the
Mhm.
findings you gotta make
And I-
if you wanna approve.
I think a version I was considering too is rather than saying contributing structure, non-contributing, you say property with a contributing structure.
Yes, I like that.
And then you're looking
I
at
like
that
that.
whole property.
Yes.
This I think is a good segue into the second topic, which is minimally visible or invisible from the street. So we've heard a desire for flexibility in design and materials when the modification or addition is minimally or invisible from the public street. For example, window replacement on the back of a historic or contributing structure, or creating an addition on the back of a historic structure. I workshopped an example of what this would mean, where you're taking in consideration the topography, but not necessarily landscaping, because landscaping can change. And looking at, are you looking at it dead on perpendicularly, or is it minimally visible from like the side? And is there interest in the planning commission on allowing some flexibility for materials and addition design where it's gonna be minimally visible or invisible?
Yes. I think so. And
think it's
actually,
good.
I'd like to pause and just give everyone online a moment to, now that Emily's kind of given us a very clear question. If anybody would like to speak up, and also welcome Shayla. If anybody has some thoughts about this, please do raise your hand or just unmute. We'll pause for a second.
That makes me better.
So do any of you have thoughts on this question of visibility? Do you have strong opinions one way or another? Online people.
I do not.
Okay.
Thank you for asking. I know it's rare, but I actually really don't.
Okay, fair enough.
Okay.
I don't either.
Okay,
I think it's,
Emily, to your point, oh, sorry, go ahead.
no, I was just gonna say, I don't have anything. I think it's clear.
To your point about using the phrase properties with a contributing structure. In that, I like that wording. In that case, would we sort of have two different scenarios or two different definitions where we have a definition of contributing structure? And there may be triggers that are specific to that. And then we also have other zoning elements which are only triggered by properties
Yes,
where the control, so there's like two levels of
yes.
two tiers, I guess.
And isn't it almost self-evident that if you're changing the structure itself, then we're talking about contributing structure. If
It's a
you
higher
have a
level.
site plan change, like a new shed or a change to parking, that's a property with a contributing structure.
Right.
Right, and I wonder too, with the certificate of appropriateness, if we even take it out of the table and it's a statement above the table. Everything in the National Register District, except routine maintenance and in-kind, is requires a certificate of appropriateness that'll be issued in conjunction with an administrative or discretionary permit where one is required, or on its own where it's, you know, a material replacement. Matt, does that make, do you see where I'm going there?
I do.
And then you just have the 2-column contributing, non-contributing properties.
Yeah, I think the thing to do is to be clear that there are standards for things that happen to contributing structures. There may also be standards for things that happen on sites that have them, and just, we should just watch with our, sort of each time we're reading something, if we understand how would this work?
In theory, it's the same permit threshold for, an addition, whether it's on a contributing or non-contributing structure, whether something's like an administrative or discretionary permit. So a subdivision, no matter what, you're going to the DRB.
Right.
So I think maybe there's some more stratification there, things that are based on contributing, non-contributing versus development standards that always apply. Just assumes. And that kind of ties in as well with the minimally visible or invisible.
No, we didn't finish that topic.
Right, yeah, that ties into it, yeah.
I mean, I think the temperature of the room is that, minimally visible and invisible from the street, like, give more flexibility.
And here I am being conscious in my use of public street. Currently, it says public way, and that's interpreted to include the rec path. So there's a lot of backyards that are visible from the rec path. and there's public way. And I think maybe even not even saying public street, just saying street, because they're in public, private, just consider the street.
Might say street and or sidewalk, just, I'm thinking like, in the example, what does minimally visible mean?
Yeah,
And it's clear that if you can stand perpendicular to the structure, basically centered on it, and see the whole facade, it is definitely not minimally visible. Sometimes I might stand on the sidewalk across the street to do that. And I think otherwise, this is the best description of minimally visible I've ever seen, and it's usually just put into the bylaw, and it used to be in our bylaw. Still is in growth management, but was, right? No, we got rid of invisible development. It's so subjective otherwise that you really get to, can I see it at all, even 1 square inch of it, or no? Which is really hard. So this to me is workable in that, if I can't see the whole thing standing there on the street or see it through the trees, it's a side wall, and it's not possible for me to see that entire side wall standing from the street. It's minimally visible. You can take a photograph and say, see, I can't see all of it, or see, I can see all of it.
And I appreciate saying that trees and greenery don't count. But I also think we have to recognize that some things would be acceptable in a location with vegetative screening, which is in our DRB or our bylaws and other places. So do we want to make an allowance? We explicitly excluded that.
Where I would see that working, and Emily, you can tell me if this is in there or not. We start talking about things like utilities and AC units and stuff like that. And the way I would have it work is the administrator or DRB or HAC may require screening for those things when they are visible or to mitigate their visibility from the street.
Even if they're minimally visible.
Even if I can't see the whole giant AC unit, the DRB or HAC or administrator can say, you've got to put some screen, either fence or vegetation around that to soften it up. I think that would have
Yeah, I think we
place
can
in
workshop
this.
that in there, yeah.
Okay.
In theory, it should be downhill from here on the topic areas. Next one is maximum footprint size. So thinking in the essence of form-based code standards, because we're going away from a units per acre metric for residential and square footage floor plan allowances for commercial, some input has been, should there be an upper limit backstop?
What did we record in the minutes of the last meeting? Because you looked at a lot of buildings and we sort of reached a consensus. And what was the number?
Right, I think it was like 4,000 or 5,000. But then some interest in, this footprint of a building on the street should probably be a little bit smaller, whereas the footprint of something that's built in the rear, like a barn, could be a little bit bigger. And so looking at Jericho Center Country Stores, about 2,600 square feet. The Park House example in Rochester, depending on if you count the port and Portco shares, like 4,000 to 6,000 square feet.
So what, did we actually put the number in the minutes? I can't remember. We had good discussion looking at real examples.
Mhm.
There,
3,000 square feet for the Jericho. Is that the same as the creamy? Or is that a different?
That's slightly different. Palmer Lane Maple is the one. We can look, I'll try to get that.
but we actually. Does somebody who was there remember what we actually wound up sort of concluding as a group?
I feel like it was something like in the front, it was like 25 or 2,600, but then that we had maybe more behind. I can't remember exactly what the numbers are we talked about.
How much is the town hall? Yeah, in the brick church. To me, in terms of massing, those in the brick apartment building, Lion apartment building are large structures in the village.
Mhm.
And we sort of don't want buildings bigger than that. Is my feeling.
Mhm. Right, so I think this one, if there's interest in that maximum footprint, we can workshop some village examples and kind of find
Yeah.
what that average
That would be
is.
super.
Mhm.
And I think we do want to articulate the difference between the front, the street presence building and what kind of back house barn is behind it. We talked about that, what if you were doing something like the Whitney Hill on that corner lot on the Whitney Hill road. And it sort of, it could extend up in the yard behind. And we thought, yeah, you could have a bigger building with quite a few residences and it would look like a barn behind a house that was not too big in front.
Mhm.
Figuring out a good way of explaining that in text, or even graphic is, might be a little tricky. Or I mean, I assume we're still talking about, you can have a smaller footprint building up front and a larger footprint building it
Yes.
back, but could those two structures technically be attached?
Yes. If we're following the big house.
So we're saying the massing.
It can be detached or attached.
Right, so
As long
it's
as there's
about the
articulation.
kind of the footprint of the front mass versus the rear.
Yes.
You might want to say something about the two masses being attached by something that's smaller than either of them,
Yes,
because that's the typical.
Yeah,
it's the
like a
house, the
breezeway or
kitchen,
something, right?
that's the little house.
The little house,
You need
right.
the little house.
You don't want to just slam the barn into the.
You need
side
the
of
little
big
house spacing to give the
Something
visual.
that's smaller than
articulation.
both of them.
Yeah, because I think that's like that example you showed me in Waterbury, Emily, right? It's like the little house and then they sort of built the connector and then,
Mhm.
Yeah,
The
they
barn.
yeah, that might even been existing.
yeah. But it creates that pattern
Yes.
and the big thing ends up the furthest from the street
Mhm.
where its
So-
visual impact is.
So
less.
maximum footprint size, we're gonna have two numbers. One is for the street presenting building and another is for total or for,
Probably for Europe.
But it's not just the maximum footprint, right? It's also the massing and the relationship to the street. Right? I mean, we're kind of bringing in those elements.
Right,
Under
yeah,
the-
and I think,
Those
I think
all-
this
yeah.
maximum footprint is just that upper level backstop.
I see.
All the massing stuff should help as well. This is just preventing something that's, too big than most of what's already here.
we even have some of that going on with the orthodontist across the street. When it was added on to for Aches,
Mhm.
they didn't really do a little house, but there is a definite articulation.
I'm wondering if the library editions run afoul of that example.
Yes, they do.
Mhm.
Is somebody gonna call us on that?
Yeah, they have to change
It was
this.
a long time ago.
Yeah.
Um,
Pre-existing condition.
And or civic buildings don't have to play by the same rules, which is something we talked about a lot in form-based code, is you get to do special things with civic buildings. Just because I'm looking at it, town hall's about 3,300.
Wait, can I show you? Wait, I did some quick math on my phone. I erased it. I had 3,200 on my calculator, but I was like, I don't.
The police station's basically twice that size. Police station's a really big building.
But it doesn't look that big.
It's not super tall. It's,
Super wide.
how wide is it? It
Because
is,
I think because of the gable end.
you've got the
Helps to
gable
break it up.
and then the other, you have a gable and then a
There are
gable,
more trees.
about 80 feet wide.
A lot of the massing elements I think the reason I came up with that number, a lot of the massing elements is if you look at a lot of the structures up and down Williston Road and you look, okay, how wide is it, about how deep is it? Like 40/80 ratio is kind of, they all fall into that kind of pretty regularly. And I think that's where I came up with some of that, saying this kind of fits in with the typical.
Put our maximum front building number at 5,000.
Uh,
4,800 is,
I thought it was 30.
oh, 36, sorry, you're right, 4 times 8 is 32.
Yeah.
Yes,
3200, which
3,200,
matches what
right.
Kate was remembering.
Right.
Okay.
Next topic, building height. So currently in the bylaws and proposed is 36 feet. This was an early standard that got missed, which is 36 feet at pre-construction existing grade. Rather than, mounding up and then measuring from the new grade. And then there is some option to give the DRB a little flexibility for details like chimneys or cupolas.
I think
Granted,
it's all fine.
A church steeple would be exempt under that 4413.
Yeah, I'm not terribly wedded to 36 feet. I think,
Has anybody complained about it?
We've heard complaints about the Lambert Lane houses because, Matt, correct me if I'm wrong, that site was graded up a bit.
They go to 36 feet above a post-construction grade, and they were constructed with quite a bit of foundation reveal and then kind of graded up to, and so if you stand at the foundation,
Newest ones or one of the two newest ones?
the taller of the two, because the other one is not a 2-story structure. And so lesson learned, we spent a lot of time on conditions with the Pentair duplex,
Yeah.
stating that the height limitation would be measured from pre-construction grade and being really clear about having it identified. And the cupola was allowed to exceed that a little bit, and it was about, some compatibility and reflection of the slate
Yeah.
barn, which, I think in the end, you ended up with a really nice kind of
Yeah.
nuanced decision by the DRB that helped, integrate that structure into its surroundings. But yeah, the village is wet.
Yeah.
What does everybody want to do? I mean, it's probably not a great place to have a basement in general.
It's terrible.
And when you try to do one, you end up building it 3 feet below pre-construction grade and then piling dirt
Piling
around it and having pretty big egress windows. So that's fine. But the maximum height is what we care about, is what that height feels like from the street, from the sidewalk. And since we're not elevating the sidewalk at the same time, that's the metric, is pre-construction.
And is that
condition.
measured to the peak of the roof or is it to the,
Yes,
Here it is.
top of the roof,
okay, top of the roof?
which means your chimney could extend above that. We've been called out on that a couple of times that.
Yeah.
certain
There's
things
exceptions such as the chimneys and cupolas, which are allowed to go for.
Yeah,
Yeah.
can a cupola go above 36 today? We just say it's not roof and therefore.
Building height
yes, or-
is 36 feet. I don't know. That's one of those vague spots.
Well, the definition.
Our
for
builders
compound-
thought very much no. They were very convinced that Matt was gonna come and tell us that we couldn't build beyond 36, so.
Well, what it
Wanna
says is,
work.
it says to the top of the roof. And we've had folks in Taft Corner say, well, that means my mechanical and my stockade fence around my mechanical can be taller than that. Because that's not roof and there's a definition there. So in other words, just look at what it says here for village, make sure it makes sense, make sure it's clear. And, you know, if 36 still feels like the right number of feet, that's fine.
Or thinking, you know, form-based code style, 2 stories with a pitched roof, which is what most things are here. I don't think there's any 3-story structures and very few things that have like, you know, a functional attic.
I don't know, I got a turret.
You're the turret, Jay.
That's not like- that's not like it's right.
That doesn't meet any of these, but,
Yeah,
Um,
but we're not gonna be building new turrets. probably.
well, but do we want to say you can't have a turret?
Chimneys, cupolas, turrets, or similar features.
I don't. If
I'm
it
a little
hasn't
worried
been,
about getting too detailed.
if it
about
hasn't been an issue, I wouldn't change it. but-
Yeah.
Mhm.
I think the only time it's been an issue was when we had that grading up happen, and also it was just. New stuff, when it's new, it looks bigger before the siding is on, it's
There's a
shocking.
landscape
Does
thing
Whitney
around it.
Hill meet this criteria with their big building?
I think so, it's actually not that tall, 36 feet is quite a lot.
Yeah.
That's the other thing, I think, is that. I think the big Lambert Lane house is like 35 and a half above post-construction grade. So that's a little bigger or a little taller at the peak than this would allow.
That's fine with me. I think that's in keeping with the, you know, as long as the massing is correct and, you know. I would rather have a little bit more building height than have some weird kind of like the hotel, you know, like the really shallow roof. I mean, flat roof might be okay, like the Lions property or the Lion apartment. But the,
So more height, if it means a proportional pitched roof. is
yeah,
okay.
exactly, right, like, and, you know, I think maybe I've just been in form-based code land too long, but at this point, but I'm kind of more interested in the look and presentation of things than really hard and fast, down to the inch kind of rules.
Lion Apartments is definitely, you know, 2 stories, but I will say it did once have a pitched roof.
Did it?
Yeah, there's a
Really?
great photo, when it was a dry goods store, with its pitched roof with the gable facing the street.
Even the current building, not the one that burned down before.
Yeah, I mean, there was some kind of, you can see the brick detail.
Yeah.
With, sitting underneath that roof, which would have been more like 36, because it's probably in the
At least
20s.
36.
Right now, it wasn't a super steep roof, it's sort of that Masonic hall kind of, whatever pitch that is, the Masons probably have a rule for that. But it's kind of that lower, maybe, you know, 612-ish sort of thing.
Well, I recommended you a few minutes ago, Kate had to leave the meeting unexpectedly.
Oh, okay.
Move on.
Yeah, location of commercial uses. So currently, commercial is allowed anywhere in the village, including quiet places like Maple Road or Village Grove or Tower Lane. The proposal is to only allow them with frontage on Williston Road. Residentially based uses like senior living are allowed everywhere. And Megan, I saw your comment earlier. Home businesses are allowed anywhere in the village. And that's not being proposed to change in this.
Okay, so what is the difference between commercial and home business?
Home business has some pretty severe limits on parking and traffic. And square footage. So in the village, 25% floor area of the dwelling or 750 square feet, whichever is smaller. No outdoor workspaces, I believe. Off-street parking, where one additional space is required must be off-street and no more than 2 p.m. peak hour trips,
And the owner's got to live there,
and the owner's gotta live there.
so.
Or the
that's-
business operator, so if you rent your
Business operator,
property, you
Right,
could,
right, right.
you could,
Okay, yeah.
you have to live on the property.
My feeling is we should allow it, if it's allowed on Route 2, it should be allowed anywhere in the district. If it meets all the other criteria. As if, for example, if somebody on Tower Lane wanted to build a little, an inn. You know, an 8-room bed and breakfast or something, and it otherwise met all the criteria, why couldn't?
That example is a good example of something that might be compatible and people would accept. I could probably throw like 5 or 6 other commercial examples that people would be like not comfortable with, I guess so. Without having the flexibility of saying, of breaking up the zone into many subzones where we can say, in this subzone, you can do bed and breakfasts and we don't have that fine tooth of, I guess, ability to dial that in one way or the other, I guess.
And I
You know,
would say some-
Chip, given some broader input I've gotten over the years, there's the idea from a couple of citizens out there that small B and Bs ought to be allowed everywhere that houses are allowed, including the entire RZD, and other residential districts in town. We've not gone there.
I think for the descriptor residentially based commercial uses like senior living, that could say bed and breakfast, or I would call that a residentially based. It's a place
Yeah,
where people are
residentially
sleeping.
based.
It looks like a house.
We should just look if we have a B and B definition. A lot of them are kind of like a super home business. They require the proprietor to be in residence, for example.
Let's,
You could
let's say the
probably
real
do that.
estate office that's up in the Letman House, or the businesses that are next to that, or Lazat Cameron. Those are businesses on Route 2. Is there a reason why one of those couldn't be on North Williston Road or on Tower Lane? Or an Old Stage Road?
I think it's a fair question. I think of Tower Lane as being awfully residential and maybe the potential for friction being the greatest against, say, a retail use. Anybody who wants lots of lights on overnight,
We're saying can't do that. That's a nuisance to you.
we are, but you go and say, you know what, I'm a B and B, my hours of operation are all the time. I get to have my lights on whenever I'm operating. And so I'm just thinking
We
of
say they
like,
have to be, there's good regulation there for lighting. Right?
I believe so, but I'm gonna tell you
It's
that
gonna be-
enforcement on lighting is awful in this town.
Yeah, I know.
The
You're supposed to
administrator's
enforce that.
terrible.
The zoning administrator is such a flatter.
Lighting is a hard one to administer.
It's hard to administer a light switch and stay on people. So all I'm saying is I think there's a level of intensity of commercial use. I think a lot of people who live in the village would be shocked to know that today a retail store could end up on the property next door to them, especially once you get off of Williston Road, where I think there's a little more.
I mean,
Perception
if we
that's gonna
wanted
happen.
to explore that possibility, I would suggest maybe saying the commercials allowed on Route 2 Williston. Off of that road, only the following commercial uses would be allowed with certain, performance standards, and then get into listing some that we felt, such as the bed and breakfasts, or some of these that we felt might be safer. But I think we would want to give them kind of specific performance standards, so they don't cause the conflicts that I think Matt is concerned about.
Right, or if you add like Old Stage Road, North Williston Road, Oak Hill Road, those are busy town arterial roads. Or even though it's across the street from Tower Lane, it's a very different level of traffic and expectation.
And an example there is if a business were to go in where the Federated Church parking lot is behind the Quick Stop. It'd be hard to say that that's not already sort of a semi-commercial area. Now there is a residence the other side of the rec path. But there's already the rec path public road.
It's very well screened.
Would you potentially have a problem with trash pickup if it's a more of a commercial operation, or parcel deliveries, early morning deliveries,
That's why we've got, I mean, that's true anywhere.
But if we move off of Route 2 into the more classically residential areas,
Dumpster pickups and
you start
things like that.
mixing those problems in.
And I think this one, like the materials list is probably a little easier mechanically to do on off if we add streets to that list. If we say beyond Williston River, adding a couple more clarifiers. I feel more comfortable with this metric.
Okay.
Kind of gauging the people at the September 20th meeting, and getting the filter on.
I wonder if it could also be some kind of like an application for commercial use. Is that, would that be too complicated? If
No,
somebody wanted to put a yoga studio in a barn that not as close as Slate Barn, like that has, you could argue Slate Barn has frontage on Williston Road, but what if there was a barn off North Williston Road, but in the village? Or if somebody wanted to put like a gift shop.
Out of curiosity, has there been any public input to this effect of saying we'd like to? Has there been any public interest in expanding the commercial areas?
Probably not, because we have so little commercial use right now.
Right,
That there's no pressure for it.
Right.
But, and in fact, I think there's probably the opposite. I think the pressure is against commercial uses. So that may be an argument to not explore this at the moment.
kind of, I guess what I'm hinting at is, do we want to start going down a road of suggesting this if there hasn't been really a lot of
No, that's a good
suggestion
point.
for it?
I mean, just because I really wish there was a yoga studio across the street.
well, I think
It should direct everything here.
the master plan's general desire for vibrancy and for there to be a lot of
To
flexibility.
get a little bit more activity.
To make use of buildings, it speaks to that. But there's a natural limit where you are gonna run into, where are we in regards to the town's capacity to enforce or to regulate or to review under an application process? As it is, when the orthodontist office was a restaurant, it was perpetually in conflict with the bed and breakfast in its backyard.
Yes, which is ironic, there's two commercial uses.
Yeah.
in the
No,
sense.
but it was effectively the Cisco truck and the trash truck backing up into the driveway of the restaurant while people at the bed and breakfast were trying to sleep, and then live music on the patio of the
Yes,
restaurant.
on Thursday
while
nights.
People at the bed and breakfast were trying to sleep. And some of that,
Perfect neighbors.
if,
Yeah, right.
if we were in a more commercial district, there would be more like
Tolerance.
just tolerance of
Yeah.
like, yeah, I'm in a commercial district, there's stuff going on. Instead, I mean, this is prior to my being here, but like early 2000s, there was just this never-ending conflict in front of the DRB between the two property owners about noise and hours of operation and what was acceptable and what wasn't, and what was allowed by the bylaw and what wasn't, which was of course really not clear at that time. And so we want to be, we've done a lot of this talking about just on Williston Road. I think the big application or the big review is you're taking a completely residential property and making it higher intensity commercial. And that, we talked about buffering and headlights and trash and all of those things. And then the question is, does that also work if it's happening up on Tower Lane or if it's happening on Williston Road? Or are we actually in a part of the district now where the expectation is far more that things are going to be pretty well residential?
Right.
I don't know that we have heard, I mean, there's a lot of ways to ask that question that could influence what
On the
people
walk,
tell you.
some of the old timers from the village didn't like the change that happened with commercial uses coming into the village. They wanted it to stay residential and stay single family homes.
Did you show them all the pictures of the gas stations that were here 40 years ago?
But it's a feeling, it's an emotion.
Yeah,
I mean, there's almost a stratification by how long people lived here. People who moved here more recently like the way it is now and want to enhance the way it is now. People who've been here for a long time want it the way it used to be.
That's everywhere I've worked.
Yeah, I think that's everyone.
I think
I've been here a long time and I'm okay with all.
I think what's really interesting though is the way used to be,
Yeah,
Yeah.
like literally like
There
1979,
were 3 food
1983.
stores.
Nobody remembers that.
There was a great deal of commercial activity.
Yeah.
There was very little nicety. There were no sidewalks there.
and there were all the
trees
trucks
weren't
to the
nice.
post office.
Yeah, I mean, there was just, it was really different looking at that color photo set from the mid-80s. And yeah, I think you're right, Michael, like the preferences just kind of change. It's like, I kind of like it the way it is, or I like it the way it's
Yeah.
going. I wish it was the way it
So-
used to be.
Tom and Kim's Market.
Yep.
That's,
So
Fiber arts.
basically now
It-
commercial isn't
before that,
limited
it
to,
was Romeo. And
Yeah.
we had the Bradishes, my father and son. Over 2 weeks ago, they were visiting from Virginia. Bob is 80, he grew up in, it's almost that. They grew up in Williston and they were telling us about all the food stores that were, there was another one at, like where the armory, and they near. where the
Near
armory
the
was.
Quonset hut. and-
Yeah, yeah.
And all
that's
that,
right,
yeah.
Yeah, but I was just thinking like, wow, there are that many foods, like groceries, mini grocery stores.
so back to the point of number 5.
Mhm.
Currently, there's no limit on where commercial can happen. And we're proposing adding a limit that has to be on Wilson Road.
Mm.
And I'm the only one seems to be questioning that.
Well, I think what could be done here is so. Non-residential only on Williston Road, senior living, assisted living, and other similar residentially based commercial uses are allowed anywhere throughout the village. And I think to Megan's point about the yoga studio, maybe there's something that's above the threshold of the home business, but is still in that category of not being as intrusive on the neighbors that we don't want to preclude. So I think this could probably be updated with some clearer guiding intent. Saying if you're not on Williston Road, you need to meet these findings,
Okay,
right, Matt? Does that sound? And we're,
I think it's it's the result we would likely end up with if we administered today's bylaw on a proposed commercial use off the Williston Road corridor. So if you can think of it as, we're just trying to presuppose a roundabout what would happen anyway.
Yeah.
Given the constraints that some of those properties face in just all of the challenges they would have meeting this
Yes.
proposed standard. Say, there's a scale issue here,
Yes.
essentially. And, you know, when we go into the town plan, we could actually write some nicer things about this, or we could follow up the village master plan, saying, now that we've thought about vibrancy, there's a spectrum of scale that's appropriate just inside of this district that makes sense, and we tried to reflect that in the bylaw, and now we're gonna backdoor it into land use
Is
designation.
it really true, and forgive me, it's been a while since I looked at the current code, that commercial uses aren't currently limited to just Wilson Road?
That's correct.
Okay,
If it's the right size, you could do it anywhere in the
to give
district.
another example, the Hempstead property is 6 acres is on the market. And if someone bought it and put 3 houses in behind the Hempstead house, and then want to make the Hempstead house into a real estate office like the one down here, why not?
Yeah,
This says that you couldn't.
right.
so that, yeah, I mean, I agree, that's a difference.
It just feels like we are clamping things that people are gonna come up with absurd examples, like, I just wanted to do what they, and it would not have bothered the neighbors, and, it seems to me like this whole document is about how not to bother the neighbors in the commercial and residential together. And so doesn't that apply on Maple Road as well as on Wilton Road? It's the argument I'm making.
Yeah, I think we could probably work on some backstop language, like if somebody were gonna do that. It gives the DRB those clear findings to keep it
Yeah,
right size.
yes,
And then aside from zoning, there's just gonna be, the general market forces where things are probably gonna wanna be on Wilson Road only because of the
Visibility.
visibility.
right. It's just that, I mean, from the beginning, our goal has been to try and provide some clarity to the, because a big part of this was clarity for the applicant. They just want to, am I allowed to do this? And flipping through the code, they can't really tell. If we go back to a system of saying, well, it depends, what are you trying to do? We haven't, I guess, moved the ball down the field in that regard. I understand that we want to give some flexibility and there's a lot of conditions that, well, maybe this would be appropriate, but my devil's advocate opinion would be, we've just kind of gone back to the ambiguity that the code had before.
Yeah, I mean, I agree that it's tricky to say, oh, we're gonna clamp down on this when simultaneously there isn't really any pressure for commercial use in the village. And our town plan says we should be encouraging mixed use
More
vibrancy.
Right.
So, yeah, I'm kind of understanding more why this may be odd.
Does the town plan give any guidance on where this vibrancy is to be located?
Boy, I don't know if we,
Yeah.
if we did it quite that well. I mean,
Usually they're not.
if I had it to write again, I might say, proximate to things like transit stops, which we had at the time, or we didn't quite have, I don't know what done with this, but sidewalks.
Yeah.
The more proximate you are to the civic center of town and the school and all of that, the more, the more focus you want to have on the mixed use, but. Maybe Chapin's right, and all of the other development standards that are in there.
Kind of
are-
address this issue of
Yeah.
adjacency.
And I think the one thing I would say is if we're thinking a little bit about process. I would want, for example, that Hempstead House example to be something that went to the DRB.
Yeah,
And to make sure that we were clear about like, maybe turning a portion of the house into a real estate office could be handled administratively, but probably not much more than that.
Yeah.
That we would have clear standards, but we would probably up the process if we were turning an entire residential property into an entire commercial property, for example.
and excuse me for losing track of this, but somewhere here, does it say if it's a commercial use, it does have to go through the.
I think we can look at those.
There was one element of that table, that was when we were talking about like the units plus
Yeah.
mixed use.
To me, if it's commercial, that should trigger that it needs to review.
Yeah,
Yeah, I go back and forth. I could see, commercial, even if it is in a mixed use building at some level, because when you're going from residential, you're gonna be looking at parking, looking at trash and maintenance, where it's like, it's a level of site plan review.
Yes.
It's a level of application that you're putting together, no matter whether it's the zoning administrator or the DRB
Yes.
who's looking at it.
well, I think sometimes it's easier to get people to be complete in their application if they know they're gonna have to go to a board. So my track record of getting people administratively to give me good lighting details is not great. They're like, well, it's just this $40 permit, and what do you want to know about lighting? And it's like, well, I could ask you to literally have a lighting plan produced by an engineer right now, but just give me the catalog sheet and tell me how high off the ground the thing's gonna be, and I can probably ballpark it. But I may not want to be ballparking it if someone's adding a small restaurant to a portion of an existing house.
Or
Where-
an inn that's trying to do an outdoor lighting thing.
Right, where then the neighbor says, hey, that light is, shining on my property, or it's way too bright, or, I can't believe you approved that, and I go, well, gosh, I didn't actually have the detail I wanted, so sometimes added process is good for just thoroughness,
Yes.
depending on the complexity of what's going on, and
You just raised, Michael, a really good point to me, which is that you talked about soft close dumpsters and stuff like that, but the trucks are still gonna have their backup signal.
Yeah, until we have electric trucks and,
They're still on backup. signal.
yeah, well, that's true. That's true. Actually, the electric trucks will have a forward signal.
Yeah.
Okay, yeah, that's good. I don't think we're gonna solve this right now, but my gut instinct would be that the best way of addressing commercial outside of Williston Road might be to sit down and come up with a list of types of commercial uses that we felt would be appropriate in a more residential setting that still allows some of that vibrancy and allows some mixed use options while trying to preclude someone coming in and causing or proposing something that we think is, we're pretty sure is gonna cause a conflict.
Conflict, yeah.
So we get closer to giving clarity to the code, so it says somewhere in the code, you're allowed to do these, 7 things. And the DRB or whoever may entertain reviewing other options based on, come to us with what you're suggesting and let's talk at least and see if it fits. But at least then we've got some clarity and we put a backstop to Emily's idea of we're kind of precluding someone coming in and doing, an outdoor dance, marathons. I don't know.
Yeah,
So-
right.
I don't know. I was trying to think of a bad example.
I just want to, I know we need to move on, but I just want to be really cautious about that because there have been some studies showing that when you divide by use, there's actually a lot of bias in that.
Mhm.
There's a great example from Washington DC, the H Street corridor where a Black business owner was not allowed to continue her business because, which was a nail salon, but a white spa owner was able to call it a health facility.
Mhm.
And so like there.
So you have a small community here where someone seeking a permit, they're known in the neighborhood and they might be better liked or less liked because it's a
Exactly.
small town and.
Right, yeah, so that's what makes me worried about the use
Mhm.
boundaries, because that's very hard, like, what's the difference between a nail salon and a.
Health spa.
Health spa, yeah,
Or
right.
some, or a
Wellness,
hair
right.
salon, like,
Mhm.
Right.
and
I'm with you.
there are ways that has been used and
Abused, right.
biased. you
I'd
know.
like to
Yeah.
regulate the conflict areas, not the use.
Yeah,
Right, and I mean, at some point, you may just say there are uses that by their nature
Yeah,
create non-mitigatable.
and well, we've already said
Impacts, right.
you can't have a loading dock.
Right, and they're industrial.
Yeah.
you
right.
know,
And chapter already,
You just
18
can't
already
have a
has things
dumpster.
about,
Yeah,
yeah, I think there's something in here about the size of
Like garage doors, loading docks.
Can't have
solid
garage
waste
doors.
storage, management bins, trash recycling must be enclosed.
big ones have.
300-gallon or larger.
Dumpsters or waste of 300 gallons or larger must be equipped with a soft close feature, sound dampening. And I looked at that.
As you point out, the trucks. are really the problem.
Right.
Right.
Well-
And sometimes,
And that's
and
what
sometimes the
makes this-
customers.
Chapter 18 has things where the DRB can limit hours of operation and delivery. Granted,
Right.
zoning enforcement is not the best tool, but it's still
Right.
a tool that's
How
out
that-
there.
that's how that defends.
That we're already working on, throughout the district.
I mean,
Mhm.
you kind of want
That's right.
restaurants in the village, which kind of trends towards big dumpsters,
Yeah.
unfortunately,
Yeah.
but. One of the other things, and certainly a challenge across the street, there is so much of the village is only accessible by backing a vehicle in off the state highway. And I mean, if you ever watched the Coca-Cola guy try to get into this place when it was a restaurant, it was. Incredible.
Painful.
Well, it was because it was the big, long, non-articulated truck. And he would just about seesaw in the middle of that as he went down in the driveway. And it would stop traffic on Williston Road in both directions for a while. Everything happens with a backup alarm, and there's not a lot of ways you'd ever want someone to retrofit like 360 driving into a village site.
Right,
It's just gonna be a challenge.
yeah, and there's that. The Conant farm and the Johnson farm, like, when those milk trucks come, traffic stops.
Yes.
And you just wait for them to maneuver, and they just start maneuvering,
Yeah.
even, like, I'll see cars that, like, she's keep going fast, I'm like, dude, you gotta wanna slow
You
down,
got
cause
it.
that guy's gonna start turning regardless of where you are,
Yeah.
he's not waiting.
But I think also just, yeah, you're gonna run into some operational conditions.
Mhm.
Haulers are actually pretty used to having that requested of them because it comes up in lots of communities around here. But it does, for every place that you allow to do that, there will be some frequency of having to call the owner and say, hey, don't forget, you really can't have your trash hauler come at 5 a.m.
Yes.
And they're gonna say, yep, I told them not to do that. They got a new manager. They must not have told him. And there's just a degree of oversight that is ongoing.
Most towns do regulate what hours trash pickup can start. And of course, the trash trucks argue that if they can't get it done before the school buses hit the roads, they can't.
Yeah. Sorry, Megan, to your point about the concern about bias in the uses. A counterpoint in that how wouldn't that same bias be present if we didn't have a list of what uses we thought were compatible and we would still entertain other things versus just saying, come to us and we'll let you know whether or not your proposed use is
Yeah,
compatible.
right. So that's why I think that the other standards being really firm and clear are really important, like the no loading docks or, the screening requirements and the hours of operation and the signs and all of those other things, like
Make those the
build
determining
up
factor.
those regulations, which are clear, objective,
Right.
they apply to everybody. There's no differential in their application.
Okay, that I understand, okay.
I would be interested in that article.
Oh, it's a book, but
That
yes,
book.
yeah. It's a great book.
Yeah, I would
I
be
use
interested.
it
And I think she would enjoy sharing it. with
Teach it in
you.
my class.
Yes.
Does that do the same thing about licensure requirements? That's been making the rounds recently.
Oh,
Hair braiding requiring like an esthetician license, even though it's just literally a person braiding hair. It tends to be an African-American thing. There are states that are imposing like really heavy, like health regulations on things that are just mechanically not applicable. And folks are saying, wait a minute, that's not what I do.
Right.
You know, so I think in general, one of our experiences with form-based code and also definitely an experience at the NAICS, the North American Industry Classification System that we use throughout our bylaw is we talk way too much about use and the distinctions between
Yeah.
use. And
Yeah.
we had this today about something, is it a gym or an indoor amusement facility? Because one is allowed in the industrial district and the other is not. And you go, but this thing the person's describing is exactly
Functions
what
exactly
you
the
want to
same,
put in the industrial district.
Yeah,
So-
like sports and recreation, it's like, is a bowling alley a sport or recreation? Well, it's like, depends on how seriously you take it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Depends on if you wear a special shirt.
Maybe a
On your own bowling
facility.
ball and shoes.
Right.
Then it is sport.
And if we look at the way we really ended up talking about uses in Taft Corners form-based code, it's really basic. It's like retail, office, big retail, small retail.
Very A level.
It's very, very general, and honestly, you get a lot of traction out of that. You know, it's like put the industrial stuff in the industrial district, put the retail stuff where you want it. You know, if you have districts that are truly only residential, you can do that, and then the other distinctions are really kind of just get in the way if you have good development standards, which that's the goal here.
Right. So I do want to be conscious of time. It's 9:05, but I think our 3 topics we can probably knock through.
I'm right now on overtime at home. Could we possibly do the solar and historic structures first of those 3? And then I'll slip out on, I might try to dial in, but could we do that?
Yeah.
Trying to think. How are the rest of you, those of you online, are you able to stay another 10 minutes or so?
Yep, that's fine.
Okay, great, thank you so much.
So municipal zoning cannot outright prohibit solar on any structure, including a historic structure. But we can continue to regulate alterations or obscuring architectural features. So just like we wouldn't let someone rip off their slate roof because they wanted to, we couldn't say you can rip off your slate roof because we can't regulate solar. We can still regulate, materials, treatments to the exterior of buildings. So I checked in with the state. We can add some clarification here so that they provide documentation that the historic structure can support the additional weight. Basically, adding solar isn't gonna, severely threaten the integrity of the building, which likely the insurance installer and insurance will want anyway. And then provide documentation that'll be mounted in a manner that does not involve removal or damage. So I don't think we can have a standard that outright says you can't have solar on the street facing side of your historic building. You would just have to do those panels in a way that's mounted respectfully. And in terms of shingles, this is an interesting one. because you would be looking at the replacement of a material. So would it be okay to replace asphalt shingles or a metal roof on a historic building with solar shingles? I think that's a fair question because there is a reasonable alternative vis-a-vis panels or ground mounted or a car park canopy where they could still in theory do solar, just not that particular shingle version.
So, I have a comment on all three of these, and the first is that, it's paramount that we do all the solar we can for our climate goals. And so that's almost an overriding imperative in my view, to encourage solar, and so it has to me to be in a strict conflict. And so if there were a solar shingle that looked like the shingles that were on the house or were otherwise compatible, I wouldn't get hung up on the material. And I feel that we shouldn't hang up on materials anyway, that we should allow, if there is a slate-like kind of material that looks like slate, you can put on your roof, I think you should be able to put it on yours as a slate replacement. So I'm against sticking to certain materials. And actually, a lot of the input from the public, their comments supporting that if it looks the same, who cares? You know, we're gonna have to say you have to use asbestos to insulate somebody. So, you know, it seems like if we have a modern material that looks the same, but functions better, go ahead. So I just want to say, I don't think we should care about the materials, we should care about the appearance. On the back side of the roof that you don't see from the right of way, to me, we should encourage solar of any type. We don't want to say, hey, you have to put it on the ground, go ahead and put it on your historic roof. Is my opinion. So we should discourage solar in the visible part of structures, even though we can't prohibit it, and encourage it everywhere else, including the backside of the story. That's my opinion on A. On B, we shouldn't prohibit solar shingles if they are appropriately looking. And on C, yes. We should add examples, more pictures, and say this is okay to have in the village district, you know, the solar canopies over your parking. And in fact, you can put the canopy there and not put the parking under it if you, and not put the solar on it if you want, because we can't mandate solar or nor if it is. Yeah, those are. Yeah, those are wild. The technology is changing, and I really apologize for having to go, but I.
That's good. Understood. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Wear your hat. Oh yeah, don't forget your hat.
And it's good to see you in person.
Good. Thanks. Take care. Have a good night.
It seems like as a minimum, we could encourage any alternative solar siting on a lot, as opposed to putting solar panels on a slate roof. On the front, the south facing roof, because it's so prominent. I told Emily I have a problem with requiring somebody to maintain or replace an expensive slate roof. And then allow them to put solar panels all over and cover potentially 80% of it. Seems inappropriate to demand that. If we can at the very least prioritize other options, because most lots would have some other options.
Well, half of the historic district is all front roof facing south, so.
Right, but they all have fairly reasonable backyards, most of them. And it's a compromise.
Or they have a barn that's, like, what about the barn, that's facing the street, the south face, like
But
behind
it's
us?
in the back.
Right,
If the barn's in the back, so it,
Mhm.
the importance goes downhill a lot in my mind.
Uh-huh.
And most of the barns are not gonna have slate roofs. There could be some exceptions here.
The police barn,
Slate
Slate barn.
Slate barn, I know.
Mhm.
That would be an exception for sure.
Yeah,
But you're right, there's not a lot of outlets that
Right.
have slate.
But you can put solar canopy type things and, you know, the trackers, I don't find them particularly attractive, but. You know,
could be minimally visible.
right,
I think that the challenge is,
Sorry, I'm writing down the Wilder Inn example.
it's hard to get solar exposure and keep it kind of tucked away and not
Mhm.
visible. That's a contrasting
Right.
purposes
Right,
there.
and I think we're pretty much limited here to historic, like changing the historic material. I'm chafing. everybody.
Oh, you got there. So fast.
Somebody nail him for speeding.
He walks.
He's
Oh.
probably, yeah, he's probably on his iPhone.
Yeah, it must be. His phone.
A municipality cannot prohibit solar collectors on roofs, including slope roofs. They can be regulated, but not that they don't fully prohibit their installation. So with solar shingles, if the municipality says no to replacing a historic slate roof with solar shingles, that is not prohibiting the installation because there is a viable alternative panels. So I don't think we can say you can have solar except on the public street facing side. I don't think we can. That's my interpretation of, what Devin was saying with the state.
Mhm.
You just have to say, show us how you're mounting it in a way that's not gonna damage the structure.
Right, so you can say, it doesn't matter what you're doing, you can't damage the historic structure, but you can't say you may not have solar. So if the act of having solar is gonna destroy, like, I'm gonna literally demolish a historic building so I can put up a tracker.
Right,
Me saying you can't demolish that historic building is not,
Is
So
not
it's not
prohibiting
prohibited.
solar.
or there's a unique cupola feature on the historic barn, and I'm gonna take that off to make it easier to have one large block of solar panels, like all the way to the top. You can't say, no, you can't, for any reason, including solar, take that cupola off. You can
Right.
still do solar panels around it, but you can't change that feature, or I'm
right,
gonna rip off all the trim so I can have. All this detailing on the trim, so I can have mounting brackets for the solar that go around on the trim.
Town should have a solar field here in the village that people can get community solar from when they have an appropriate building.
we're discussing that with our energy planner, that it's a mid-range energy plan goal to designate and have town land that you community solar sites for exactly that reason, because whether it's village or just where somebody lives, there's a lot of folks who would like to have access to solar that don't have the ability to do it on their property.
For whatever reason,
But
Zoom is
solar
not letting
canopy
me.
right here in the back parking lot.
mute
That's also
Chapin. Hey,
beyond
Chapin, we're
community.
getting a little background noise. Can you mute? Matt, if I make you co-host, are you able?
I'm not actually doing a Zoom meeting.
Oh, yeah, you're not even in. the
I'm just
Zoom
taking
meeting.
minutes, so.
I'm sure I see you right there.
Oh, he muted. Okay,
Oh,
thank
You muted.
you.
Okay.
That is bizarre. I was not able to mute him.
Okay, so wrapping this up.
The last two are pretty quick, overall intent page, so providing some more images and clarity that new buildings facing the street should predominantly look residential. With the way entrances are oriented, building masses are oriented. And some guidance for new commercial. And then the last one, a standard for required private open area. So a lot of the input we heard on the walking tour and community meeting. A defining characteristic of the village is open space, is properties with backyards or ample side yards. And if the planning commission's interested, Matt and I can find out what metric works. Is it a percentage? Is it, how is it done so someone can't, fully develop a property and there's not even a small place to have a patio or a garden, that kind of thing.
Yeah, I think we talked about it a little bit as, when you hear that fear. That with the flexibility of the standards under consideration, what would happen? Could somebody max out a site in a way that was compliant with all the rules, but really incompatible with the village? And so in addition to the other things that play against maxing out a site, like having setbacks and minimum parking and landscaping requirements, et cetera. Another one, and this is something that plays a role in the Taft Corners form-based code, is some minimum open area. a area that is not building, that is not parking lot, that is not dumpsters, that's not in the setback, that is essentially a yard or lawn or gathering space, but especially is not building. And I think once you start requiring that, and someone looks at even the largest sites in the village and starts trying to fit everything in, they won't be able to max out the residential density. They especially won't be able to max out the residential density in a bunch of big single-family homes that are all packed in some kind of a pattern that just doesn't fit with the village at all. So we talked a little bit about just kind of looking at some existing layouts in the village and saying, most.
What's the average green space?
Right, most places you look at in the village that we would think of as being pretty well fully developed have some open area. Here's about how much that is in relationship to lot size or development.
Per unit or per unit basis.
Right. So that's what that is.
All right,
All right,
is that the end of,
that's the 8
Discussion?
topics I had.
okay, that's great.
Now on to part 2.
Yeah, if you all turn the page.
Okay, so, we do have 2 more quick little items. The form-based code debrief, do you want to skip that or do that?
I'll just tell you what's
Okay.
coming next.
Sure.
So the select board will be meeting again on August 23rd, which is their next meeting to discuss the form-based code. We went over the remaining places where they might change something, which was three developer requests: building height, green space, and administrative procedure. Of those, I think the select board sort of is okay as is on administrative procedure and green space. They've not signaled any direction on requests from any of the 3 major stakeholders or on building height yet. Where they would go would be, there's no decision on the agenda on August 23rd. If they were going to vote to adopt what the planning commission had transmitted to them without any substantive changes, they could do that on September 6th. If they did say, well, we do have a couple substantive changes we want to make, if they can tell me what those are, we could prepare a follow-up public hearing for September 20th. That's form-based code.
And
But it is the law of the land right now, right?
As well as the current bylaw, which means we're kind of paralyzed on new site plan development until about November 13th. That law of the land rule runs for 150 days. It's from the date of the first hearing, which was July 5th. So it's permissive, but it's very hard to do what form-based code allows and also meet the requirements of the existing bylaw. We're in the zoning vortex right now.
So you're in limbo.
We're in limbo. So the sooner that's over, the better for everyone, but I certainly hope it's because the FBC's adopted more or less looking like what you gave the PC, because I think, or it gave the select work, so it's a good piece of work. It's kind of feeling like we're getting there. I was actually a little afraid they just say, okay, go on the transmittal draft, because there are a couple things that came out of legal review that I need to have in there. They're not really substantive. It's about flexibility around utility placement. And a couple of other things, but I have a feeling they will change at least one substantive thing, and we're likely looking at a hearing on the 20th. That's my best guess. That doesn't have to be a giant hearing, but procedurally, if anything changes substantively, there has to be another hearing.
work plan survey.
Yeah. Stay tuned to see this. I was trying to bang one out to get to you today, but we want to have a future session at the planning commission as we go into, we're in FY23 and starting to run into our town plan for FY24 work plan. We've talked a little bit, Megan and Emily and I, about wanting to poll planning commission members about, in general, each of your motivations to serve on the planning commission, and make sure that your voices are all heard by one another and the staff about what you'd like to accomplish in the coming fiscal year and beyond in your time on the planning commission. We can give you a little bit of a preview of what we know is going to show up back in front of the commission. And our stated goal is very much not to have you all work as hard as you have been working for the last 2 years, but return to something a little more normal, while accomplishing some of the things that brought you to sign up for this unpaid work that you all do. So I'm going to try to put that together as a little online survey that can inform just a round robin conversation at a future meeting, to make sure that we as staff aren't leading you down the path of projects you don't want to be working on, while achieving a few more town plan goals and thinking about what we want that next town plan to say and look like and feel like. Because we've done a lot of talking about that internally, but we haven't had time to do it at the planning commission in a while.
Mhm.
So stay tuned for that.
Okay. Quick question, Jason?
And you're muted, you'll have to unmute.
Yes. A couple of us volunteered to work on the blurb for the annual report, and I think we haven't got the starting document from staff yet. Is that right?
I remind everybody of that every time I meet with Matt.
Yeah, we'll follow up on that one. we promise.
Everybody need to remind me.
Everybody, well, today was you and Emily, so everybody.
I
We'll
just,
get it to you.
I so much appreciate everything you're doing, so it's not a complaint. I just wanted to make sure I hadn't missed it. Thanks.
You haven't missed it.
Well, thank you, Chapin.
Okay, any other final comments, questions? Great, thank you all for staying on a bit extra, and I will move to adjourn. Thank you, and thank you, Michael.
Oh, no
for coming.
problem.
It's really
Everybody.
helpful to have you here, so great to meet you and your input.
Thank you.